Hello viewers, welcome back again in my channel Inojit Creations. So today we know about the experimental research. So let's start. Today's topic is the experimental research. Experimental research. So experiment, this word also said that the some things also be experiment in a lab. So this is, we can say this with the lab basis experiment. Lab basis research or experiment. Lab basis research. Lab basis research. So in this here, when we research some things is which is the most of the scientifically, and it must be a lab oriented and must be some scientific way. So these times we use this experimental research, as well as when we found a new things, or when we discover a new things, and when a researcher discovered or invented a new things which is related to the lab basis, with that times the researcher conduct his experimental research. So experimental research is basically means you do innovation, or you discover a new things, and you are also create new things. Next we know about the experimental research some rules. So this experimental research also based on some rules, and which is most necessary for the experimental research. So we know the experimental research rules at first. So those are the rules of the experimental research are: number 1, rules. This is the rules of experimental research. Rules that is most mandatory for the experimental research. Number 1 is the method of agreement. Number 2, the method of difference. Number 3, joint method. Number 4, the method of residues. Number 5 is the method of concomitant variation. So those are the experimental research rules. So number 1 is the method of the agreement, and number 2 is the method of the differences, and number 2 is the joint method, and number 4 is the method of the residues, and number 5 is the method of the concomitant variables. So those are the most important for the experimental research. Next we know about the types of the experimental research. Next we know about the types of the experimental research. Next is the types of the experimental research, or ER. So in this year has some types for the experimental research. So those types is the most important for this research. So number 1 is pre-experimental research. Number 2, true experimental research. Number 3, quasi experimental research. So these are the three types of the experimental research. Number one is the pre-experimental research, number two is the true experimental research, and number three is the quasi-experimental research. So at first we know about the pre-experimental method. What is the pre-experimental? When a researcher experiments his selected items or selected topic or selected problem, that times he must be aware on his particular topic which he is invent or which is be discovered by him. So this pre-experimental research is when a researcher selected a group for his the research, and that times he must be aware for this group and he must be observation this group for a long time. So this is the one group oriented, and sometimes this group must be observation types. So this is the pre-experimental types. Next is the true experimental research. So true experimental research, in this here the researcher is now involved in the research types, and he also know about the every parts of the research, and he know how to the concluded the research and his what is the outcomes of the research. That times he make the true experimental research. So in this here the researcher most accurate the experimental facts, that is the most accurate of experimental fact also included this true experimental research. And last is a quasi experimental research. So quasi experimental research, when the researchers who is sometimes he is disbalanced about his research and he want to the make difference between the two groups or the two variables, that times he use the quasi experimental research. There is the assign of two different groups, different groups also involved here. So the experimental types has number one is the pre-experimental research, number two is the true experimental research, and number three is the quasi-experimental research. Now we know about the characteristics of the experimental research. Next is the characteristics. Of experimental research. So there are most of the characteristics is used in the experimental research, which characteristics is most involvement the research items, and it is the more powerful forces to the research. So those characteristics are listed here. So number one is characteristics. Number one is controlling variables. Number two is repetition. Number three is reliability, and number four is accuracy. So those are the characteristics of experimental research. So we know differently those characteristics here. So number one characteristics is the control variables. So in this here we know the research items is also based on the experiment or lab basis. So must be the main characteristics of control variable. When the researchers conducted these research items, he must be the control the all variables. So we know that there are the three types of the variable. So number one is the independent, number two is the dependent, and number three is the moderate or intervening variables. So the researcher want to be control this all types of variable for his research work. In this, next is the repetition. Repetitions on this research also the experimental base, and this research also the scientific oriented. So researcher must be avoided the repetitions, and he conscious about these repetitions formations. And next is the reliability. His work or his research work is reliable for the everyone, is reliable for the society. It is must be conscious about this matter. So reliability is the best characteristics for is the experimental research. So next we know about the accuracy. So in this experimental research we know that accuracy is the most effective. If any items of the research is must be constant, then research will be done by the researchers. So the researcher must be follow and must be notice the accuracy parts of the research. So those are the characteristics of the experimental research. Now we know the stages of the experimental research. And so we know about the experimental research steps or stages. So steps of experimental research. So number one is the most effective step is the selection or selecting the problems. So this is the main part of experimental research. First you have select the problem. Next we know the formulating hypothesis. Next we know about the number three, constructing the experimental design. Next number four, check reliability and validity. Next number five is use of right statistical techniques. And lastly number six is preparing the report. So in this here the experimental research has some steps. So number one is the selection the problem. Next is the formulations of the hypothesis. Next is the constructing the experimental design. Next check the reliability and validity. And number five is the use of right statistical use the right of the statistical techniques. And number six is the preparing the report. So at first the researchers know this research is based on the experimental oriented, and this research also based on the lab basis. So he must be aware for the selecting the problem. So at first he had selecting the problem. Next the formulation hypothesis. Which hypothesis is be useful for this research? Those hypotheses will be the accepted here, and those will be the hypothesis will be the rejected the research. He must be formulation that, and he choose those hypotheses at first. Then the constructing the experimental design. This here the researcher must be construct the experimental design, which designs be useful for his research and which is not. Next number four is the check reliability and validity is the most effective for the research works. In this here the his validity or his research topics is valid or not must be checked by the expert, and his research is the most of the reliable to the for his society and to his others. He must be checked first. So this is the main or is most effective steps of the experimental research. So check the reliability and the validity test. Next, number 5 is the use the right statistical techniques. So in this here the researchers use the researcher use the statistical techniques, like it is here he must be the statistical like mean, median, mode etc. like ANOVA and ANCOVA test will be accepted here, and as well as he know the test value of table, and as well as he make the conclusions later. So number 6, the preparing the report, and at last he must be aware the preparing for the report and whole the steps is most effective for the experimental research. For preparing the report, the researcher must be aware for every parts of the research steps and must be maintain the characteristics of the experimental research. So those are the steps of the experimental research. So those experimental research must be effective for the experimental research. So class, today we have learned about the rules of the experimental research and what is the experimental research, and as well as know about the types of the experimental research, as well as we know about the clear cut idea about the characteristics of experimental research, and lastly we have achieved some knowledge about the steps of the experimental research. So class, today I have end this session here, and next day I will come with a new topic. So take care, bye.